So welcome back as we start to wrap this year. National elections in Kenya, Lesotho, Angola, Ethiopia, all of these countries, and of course also AU-led talks in Tshwane and military coups in the Sahel region, and most recently this week, attempted coup in Gambia. All of these are issues that have been top of mind for so many of us here on the African continent. So to help us unpack some of what happened, some of the major stories that have grabbed the headlines on the continent, we are joined in studio by Pan-African analyst, Ras advocate Sipho Mantula. Thanks so much for coming through.
Asante sana, thank you, Jambo Africa, and refreshing morning to our viewers.
And it's good to have you in studio and not on the video wall.
On the Zoom, yeah?
Yeah, so
correct.
It's absolutely great that at least things have changed for the better in that regard. But of course, the African continent continues to stumble along year after year and still beset with many problems. But Advocate Mantula, perhaps starting with attempted coups, because this is still one of the issues that we are grappling with as a continent. So let's start with the latest and moving backwards.
You know, Sisakina, when you look at the military coups in the African continent, is the issue of appetite of power by the military generals. What happened in Banjul this week is a repetition of 2019, when Adam Barrow came into power and people who were close to Yahya Jammeh attempted the coup in 2019. Come 2022, once more this week, there was an attempted coup. So the issues of military coups is the issues of poor governance. Like I said earlier, appetite of the army to be into power. We see it in Sudan now, Khartoum, where you have the army generals there. But also I think the issues of military coups in Africa days back is democracy working. Because we have all these coups, and the issue it is that there is the sense of that the military generals are not happy with the executive. And that's what has happened in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, early this year. We saw 2 military coups in one country in 2022. Burkina Faso, Damiba taking power from Kaboré. Before the end of the year, Traoré, a young man at the age of 34, took power from Damiba again. Those push and pull factors, I think, is the question also of the hidden hands behind these coups. Because military coups and civilian coups are different. And hence I said there might be hidden hands in this conflict or in this military coups.
Hidden hands from where, though?
You know, when you think of the Sahel region, we know that there was a tension, animosity between the French and Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Conakry. But also there's this Russian appetite moving towards the Sahel. And then you have a USA interest also in this Sahel coups. Then you have EU. That's got interest putting pressure on ECOWAS all the time on how to deal with military coups. And remember that the AU Constitutive Act doesn't allow military coups anymore. I think the era of military coups ended in the late 60s, late 70s. But I think it's a repetition of that, those hidden hands, like I said to you, it's all about the change of power. What people will say, is there an interest from the West to change some of the, like when you saw in Chad, when you saw in Mali, Assimi Goïta when he was taking power, and the animosity with France, that was there. The issues around the sanctions, when you have military coups, you have sanctions being used against those military leaders. And I will always say those sanctions are sometimes stupid sanctions. They don't work. They actually suffocate the ordinary people. So those hidden hands, in short, I will say to you, is the West.
So are certain areas more prone to military coups, and why? And also, if a country has gone through a coup, because we're now talking about repeat coups in certain states, how do they get past that? You know, how do they ensure that this doesn't become the status quo in any particular state?
You know, the problem is we were beginning with Gambia. Gambia had more than 6 or 7. When you think of Guinea-Conakry, Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, even when Sankara came into power, there was a military coup. Yahya Jammeh came into power through military coup. The only challenge that I think is how do we deal with the civilian transfer of power. You have this issue that I raised earlier of Sudan, Khartoum, where Bashir left power, Burhan came in, Hamdok came in, and Hamdok was pushed out as a civilian leader. So for me, it is also the issue of civilian and military relation, the issues of governance. Do these leaders who rush to the State House have an appetite or an interest of the citizens? And that's how I can say to you, post-military coups, they become also repetitive because of others were promised that you'll become a minister, you'll become somebody. And that's where we saw with Damiba. But Damiba, I think his connection with Blaise Compaoré, to bring him in Ouagadougou, troubled people like Traoré, and Traoré took him out.
And of course, how do we move away from that? Because it's not in the interest of those nation states nor the region to have these coups take place. And what's the role of the African Union in ensuring peace and stability?
My sister, like I said earlier, Sakina, we have an African Charter on election, democracy, governance that talks about coups. And then we have this election period that you said democratized. I think we are not winning at that level because you have elections, but later again we have civilian and a military unrest. I think the issue is how do we balance it? The AU has its own laws. It can suspend you, like both Sudan, Guinea-Conakry, Mali were not allowed to be part of AU decision-making. So I think you have repercussions once you go under military coup. But for me, it's how do we promote African democracy? But
do those repercussions necessarily filter down to the extent that it would actually discourage, militaries from taking over power?
I don't think so. I think that nature of that the military always has this upper hand of politics of the state. They will always want to remain influencing the state. Hence, I say to you, all those military coups that happened this year were set because they actually put these countries into sanctions. They put ECOWAS to meet every time, envoys going in and out of Guinea-Conakry, Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso, Mali. All those regions, like I said to you, again, natural resources are one of the triggers and the cause.
Natural resources that, of course, are not being exploited to the benefit of the people,
of the communities,
of those nations, which is very sad. But let's talk about elections. Quite a few interesting elections, important elections also taking place on the continent this year. A neighboring Lesotho, Equatorial Guinea, we had Kenya, Angola. There were quite a few important elections on the continent this year.
Remember, Kenya, it was interesting because it had a repetition of 2017. There was the court case. The old man, Raila Odinga, could not make it. William Ruto came into power. We call him the hustler, the chicken seller. William Ruto came into power, but it was very narrow. And then we saw how the Constitutional Court affirming Ruto, not doing what they did in 2017. Angola, we saw UNITA giving MPLA flames, giving them a shock a bit in Luanda. Lesotho, we saw the new entrepreneurship, a businessman, Matekane, come into power. Equatorial Guinea, I think we saw a monarchy of a president come into power again, Obiang, the longest serving president, by the way, in this African continent. So if you look at those elections, I think they have made some changes because there were no conflicts. Most of them, they were peaceful. But if you look at Kenya, Kenya was on the brink because you had 4 commissioners who did not agree with the chairperson, Chibukatu. And I think Sarakiman did a great work, Sakina, when he was reporting Kenya. For me, when I looked at Kenya, SABC did a very rolling coverage of Kenya. Angola, like I said, Lorenzo, it was difficult for him, for MPLA to deal with UNITA that is rising. And UNITA was complaining, by the way. There was a court case, by the way. It's only Lesotho that you don't have an electoral dispute there. But other 2 countries, you had. And come 2023, you have Zimbabwe coming, you have DRC, it's going to be heated.
And looking at Lesotho, Does this augur well for Lesotho as a nation that has been struggling economically and otherwise? You look, for example, to a country like Zambia with the election of Hakainde Hichilema and how his election has changed the fortunes of Zambia, who are now on a very good trajectory. You look at the strength of the currency and all indicators, seemingly positive for Zambia now. And people had said, this is a guy, he's business-minded, he's going to come in and change things. It seems as though that is happening in Zambia. What about Lesotho? Can they be looking at a similar sort of situation?
I think so, but remember, in the kingdom, politics of coalition and the politics of the militarization of politics there. But I think having a businessman, it will change because he was becoming Sankarist. He was becoming Sankara. They're saying, we're not going to occupy the houses. We're not going to be driving expensive cars. We're going to deal with the debt. But I think, as you know, many African leaders, they just went to Washington recently. And I think Lesotho got some, maybe a financial aid from Biden. And Lesotho, I think the issue again is how to deal with the corruption there, how to deal with politics of coalition, that they don't relapse. Because the problem of Lesotho is that you can have a coalition for a year or two and they will relapse. And hence we had the SADC mediation that was not ending. Hence we had our former Deputy Chief Justice dealing with the issue of Maseru. But as you said, many other countries, they are trying post-election to deal with their challenges. But even after elections, Sakina, they are still running to the IMF. You saw how Ruto came into power, but he went to the IMF. We saw Angola as well is going to the USA and NATO to deal with NATO now. Angola is moving away from Russia, by the way. So post-election is that the presidency looks to say, where is our new alliance? So all this.
But what's wrong with Africa? Why are African leaders incapable of, at this stage, coming together and just perhaps for a moment sitting together as just African leaders? But then I'm just quickly reminded, as I think about it, the AU headquarters was built by the Chinese for Africa. Okay, never mind. but the point is, what is wrong with our leaders such that they are seemingly incapable of coming together, forging a way, finding a way, a plan, a path on which to take Africa so that we can exploit the mineral resources of this continent for ourselves?
No, correctly. But Thomas Sankara warned them in 1987 when he went to Addis Ababa. He says, you are actually present in Paris and Washington and London more than in Addis. You don't deal with your national domestic issues here. You rush to the summit that was called by France, the summit that has been called by USA recently, and they're all going to sell their souls at the highest bidder, at the highest price there. And that's where I think, like the AU theme of this year, Sakina, what was the theme? Not many people they know about it. It was around food security, the nutrition, how do we deal with food? But Ukraine came and interrupted us to deal with the food security. And Ukraine, there was all about the wheat issue, the oil, the food. And that actually will have given us opportunity to trade amongst ourselves and not to rely on the war that we don't know. We are not part of it, because all these world conflicts that have been happening, we are never part of it. So like you say, African leaders sometimes, I'll always say they lose signal, they lose data. They don't have enough airtime.
And then there's load shedding to add to the
There is the load shedding, and maybe it is at
no signal.
Maybe level 6 or 7, maybe it's stage 12, we don't know.
Buffering all the time. All right, and then there's, of course, diplomatic issues as well. Closest to us, perhaps, you look at what's happening with the DRC and Rwanda. And you have Tshisekedi,
Ethiopian peace talks as well.
Yes, accusing Kagame of sponsoring the M23 rebels, all those sorts of things. And all of these peace talks that are taking place, we see ceasefires for a while, and then it just seems to go on again unabated.
One thing, Sakina, what worries me, if you can recall, I've been to the Eastern DRC, and when I think of Goma, I think of the neighboring is that peace has never been seen there. And the inter-Congolese dialogue that has been going on in Kenya, they're going back in Goma actually next month. Uhuru Kenyatta is trying, but it's quite difficult because Uhuru Kenyatta is not a military person. He's the head of state. So as a mediator, you need to have that foresight, oversight, and insight. And like you said, Kagame says, no, I'm not part of this. Tshisekedi said, but you are bringing this M23 because I'm going for the elections come 2023. Now, the UN Security Council have renewed the mandate of the UN peacekeeping mission in that part. I spoke about is the peace talks that we held here in South Africa of Ethiopia. Also, Kenya, it plays a key role. Uhuru Kenyatta, Obasanjo, Mlambo Nga were part of that peace talk. So I think the peace talks to hold, Sister Sakina, is the civilian involvement. Do we involve the civil society in these peace talks? Do we involve the women? Or do we just want to have a military solution? Because all these conflicts that have been going on in the peace talks is always about ceasefire, humanitarian access. But do we talk about strengthening institutions of democracy? We are not. And I think that's where we are failing.
Advocate Mantula, I'm going to give you a challenge for the new year. Let's look at how things can improve and where African leaders can perhaps tighten up and make things better for their people. So let's have that conversation at the beginning of the new year. We are unfortunately out of time for this segment. That was Pan-African analyst, Advocate Sipho Mantula, helping us unpack some of the major stories that dominated headlines here on the African continent.